Welcome to the part 10th of our React core series. In this part, we'll learn about how we can test our React applications, how we can perform the unit test and the integration test, and how we can perform tests on our asynchronous components by mocking the network API calls using MirageJS. And we'll also touch upon something called as the Snapshot Testing using Jest and React testing library. And we'll see also how we can debug those test scripts that we write. In order to test your application, you have two ways. One is called the unit test and the other one is called the integration test. So let's look at how we can perform an isolated unit test on one of our components here, which is a search input box component. So the very first thing that you need to do is go here in your project directory and look for the search box component. If it is not present inside a folder, maybe put it inside a folder named as search box. And there we go. We then create a file with the same name, but with the suffix of test.jsx or tsx if you're using TypeScript. And that's it. Now inside here, you'll need to import these utilities. So if you bootstrap your project with create React application, these are some of the dependencies that are pre-loaded in the application. And those are testing library. It's called as the React testing library suite. And they have these three things. So Jest DOM introduces something called as DOM matchers for the Jest environment. And testing library / React is a library which helps you render the component inside the test environment, and user event library is used to simulate the real kind of user events in your test environment. So let's import one of the very important utilities called as from the testing library / React, and that is called as the render utility. So using it will render our component, the search box component. So let's import our component as well, which we want to render, and that is search box from search box. Just like you might have used this thing inside the actual app.js component, right? Inside the user list component, we have this. So we have the search box component, which take two props, value and onChange. So we'll have to import and use it in the same manner. Now here, by using describe, this is Jest testing environment. So we'll have to use the Jest syntax of testing. So the way we create a test suite in Jest is by using the keyword called as describe. And in the first argument, we pass in the test suite name, search box component, and in the second argument we pass in a callback function inside which we provide the test cases themselves, and same way we pass in the name of the test case, which is simply it renders the search box component with initial value passed, and you just provided some descriptive name so that it's easy to identify it when it renders in the console. We'll see that in a moment. Now, as a very first step, you will need to render this component, and let's throw the render result into a variable called as result, and let's call our render function. Now, in here, you can actually write JSX. Now, in order to write JSX, you have to make sure that the extension of this file is JSX as well, otherwise it'll throw some bizarre warnings. Now, just like you might have used this thing inside your user list component like this, we'll similarly render it here. But you have to make sure that you keep this thing in mind, that you are rendering this thing in an isolated way. It's not a part of your application, which means if there are any certain contexts that are being referenced inside this component, and you don't provide, obviously you're not wrapping anything, this component with any context providers, so they might misbehave. So since our component already isn't dependent, it's a very isolated component. All it's doing is rendering a input component and taking these two values as inputs. So this particular component fits very well for unit testing. All we need to do is provide some value. So for example, I provide an initial value of init value. And how can we test the onChange? So onChange is a method which needs to be passed here. So, and how can we actually test that onChange was called when some input, when user input some text inside this search box? So for that, we need to create something called as the Jest Mock functions. So in order to create that, let's create a variable called as mock onChange. Now that's the naming convention. You have to prefix the name of the method with mock keyword, and the way you do it is by doing just this jest.fn. And inside here you can provide some implementation, right? You can return anything, but we aren't doing anything of the return value. So simply by this means we can create a mock function. We'll see its use in a moment. Mock onChange. So our result is stored. Now let's run it. Let's try to run it. Result.debug. Now this debug thing, this debug function just spits the output on the console of whatever HTML is present inside this component. So let's save it and try to run it. Now, in order to run it inside the package.json, you already have this command by create React app. It's called as test, and what it does, React scripts test. So simply, if you're using npm or yarn, you can use npm test, and it'll start this script. And right now we just have this search box.test.js. So what it do is it search for it looks for all the files with this extension. So right now we just have this file, so it will run this test for us. Now it says React is not defined. So we assume that React was imported, and it wasn't. Now why React needs to be imported here, as you know, when JSX gets transpiled into React.create class, and if React keyword is not present inside, it will throw an undefined or undeclared error, fatal error. So now it should work fine. So right now our test is doing nothing, it's just logging the output, the HTML output of that component. So you see, the test case passes because we haven't written any expectation or a test matcher over there. This is the log that we are getting. Right here you won't get the JSX, you will get the actual DOM representation of your element. So you have this, and the value of the input box is this. So what we can do is, what we are checking here is that when you pass some value to this given component, you get this as a value of that input component. So we need to get a reference of this, get hold of this input type search component, which is actually a styled HTML component. The way to grab reference in an easy way is to provide this attribute as data-test ID, and you can provide some value to it, such as search input, and here we'll reference it as search input box equals to. Now this result of JSX that you got, this has this method called as get by test. You can see there are a lot of these methods. So one of them is get by test ID, and here we can pass the test ID. And now we need to write some matcher. It's called that's what will make this test complete. By it's called as assertion. And here we'll write search input box, and this expect clause from Jest, it has a lot of methods. One of them is to have value, and let's see if it passes. So yes, it is passing. And now let's move ahead. Now we have got an initial render of our component. Let's write another test case which says, let's just copy this and duplicate it right beneath it. So it renders the search component with change when change happens. The change will happen due to user event. Now, how can we possibly simulate the user event? So React testing library provides another method called as fire event. This is another very important method in order to simulate the user event. Now, this is taken again from the user event library that we discussed. So it's just available as an import on the same testing library module itself. So the way it works is we first need to render our component inside this block. And here we'll again grab reference of the search input box, and we'll write fire event dot the name of the event. Now, what kind of event do we want to fire on this input search box? So it's going to be a change event because we are listening for the on change event. So we need to trigger the change event. Had this been an on click or on mouse click or on mouse enter or something, it'll be dot mouse enter or dot so and so event. But here it is change event, and the change event, as you can see, it accepts the first argument as the element itself, and the element is search input box, which is the DOM element. And the second argument is like you can provide the event itself. So as you can tell from the on change event, the on change event gets an event, and we might be looking for event.target.value property. So here you can actually create the event. For example, const change event equals to, usually we do event.target.value. So we have to kind of mimic that behavior, and the value, let's say the new value is new value. And here we will reference this change event, this mock change event. And how can we now possibly write an assertion? So the way is to get a hold of this mock on change thing that we just created initially. And this jest.fn is a utility which exposes some metadata with which we can tap into and say that this function was called. So for example, if I just log it, mock on change. So if I just log it, let's see what happens. So you see here we are getting all these properties on that mock function that we had. And here we have this mock object property on it, mock, and internally it has a lot of other things like calls, which represents the calls that happen to this function. So that's what we need to identify, that this function got called, this property that of onChange that we passed into this component, it got called. So the way to do that is simply in Jest we have this matcher called as to have been called. So we just need to, we are just checking that this function got called, and that is it. Yes, so both of our test cases are passing, and this whole test suite is passing now. So we have one test suite so far and two test cases inside it so far. And before moving any further, let's understand the anatomy of the test. So a test basically can be divided into three parts. It's called as the AAA pattern, which means arrange, act, and assert. This means that a test can be divided into three subgroups. So arrange is where we are arranging the data. So for example, if we look at this particular test case, this is where the arrangement of the test is happening. We are rendering our component which we want to test later, right? And this is also a part of the arrangement here. We are getting out the search input box component from the rendered result. And this is where the assertion is happening. Assertion means we are asserting that this is what we need from this test. This should pass, or else the test should fail. And the act part isn't present here. For act part, let's go here. So this particular line is the act part. This is all arranged, and this is the act part, wherein we are actually firing some event. We are acting upon our component to produce some results, and those results we are asserting right here. So that's a normal taxonomy of a test, of any testing framework, not only Jest, but any other testing framework as well. Also, there's you can see some repetition is happening here. Now, in order to avoid that, so here also, for example, we need to render the component and here as well, and both of them are using the same inputs. So what we can do is, before calling all of the tests, we can have something like a before each inside this describe block, and create a variable called as result outside so that it can be shared, and result equals to. So we'll prepare this result by doing this, and it's just some sort of refactoring. The end result will still look the same, and that is it. Now, before calling each of the test case, this line will run, and it will populate the result variable with the rendered result of this search box component, and it'll still pass our test case. Now let's move further with our testing process, and let's write an integration test right now. Now, integration test means that we are testing the components not in isolation, but rather how those pieces will fit together and perform in an integrated manner. So the very nice candidate for that would be our users list component. So if we look at the user list component, it's present here, and let's create another file called as maybe index.test.jsx, or let's say users list.test.jsx. So again, the same way we will import these things, React and the render environment. Now let's create our test case, test suite, users list integration test, and inside here we will write our test cases. This is some autocomplete problem, and the first is, let's say it renders it loads the component, loads the users list. Now here let's render. I won't do refactoring this time as I've shown it already, and let's render the component as users list, and it accepts no property, so let's just leave it like that, and let's see the result. So it is showing nothing but the input box component. And why is that happening? Because let's examine our users list component, and inside this return block here, we are entering the list of users when on filtered users. Now, filtered users initially is a blank array, and which is what we are getting, because it'll get populated due to this asynchronous event, and in future when this callback will be called, only then it will be repopulated and it will get re-rendered. Now, inside our test environment, this fetch call might have been happening, but it is an asynchronous event. So immediately we can't check that we can't perform such assertions. So maybe here, first of all, as there should be, in case of a good application, there should be some sort of check here, like if the length is 0, then maybe we should have something like a loading like this, and let's assign it a test ID as well inside our test here. Now if we see the result, we'll get this loading thing, which means the call has been fired and we are waiting for the results. So maybe we can now apply a check on that loading element like this, result dot get by test ID as loading. You can name it something more specific in order to avoid the name clashes. And here now we can have loading element dot to be in the document. Yep, so our test is passing and we had our loading thing. Now let's move a step further. Now this is an interesting part. Here you have the fetch API call, which is making an API call to the api.github.com/users. Now you can't guarantee when the result would come back, right? Because it will depend on the network conditions. And it's never a good idea to make the actual API calls inside your test cases. For example, if you're doing load testing, if you're checking how much load your system can bear, so you can't make 10,000 API calls inside your test, right? So anyway, it's always a good idea to mock these network calls inside your test environment. Now there are a lot of ways you'll find on the internet for accomplishing this. There's something called as the fetch mocks, and there's something called Jest Mocks, or something called as MSW. That's quite recent. But my personal favorite is this something called as MirageJS. Now it actually mimics the API calls, and doesn't matter which client you're using, if you're using fetch, Exaios, or any other library or tool for making the API calls in your app. Because this will sit at the server level, and the API itself is really very easy. So we'll just install it, and the installation is very simple. npm install MirageJS. And while this is installing, now we need to create a server block which will contain our routes. So we can create a file at the root level inside the src, something called as mirage.js, and here we'll import mirage from mirage.js. And here we'll create a server by using the server constructor, by passing in new, by writing the new keyword. And whenever this file gets loaded anywhere, so this instance will get created, and it will actually hijack the network calls at the browser level or in the test environment global network level. So here we need to provide, so this is an object, and we have to provide this property called as routes. And inside this, we can define our routes in a very sort of Express.js fashion or Node.js fashion. And it's like this dot get, and we have this get endpoint, which is serving our users. And in the second parameter, you can pass the response. Very simple. You can pass so here we need to pass the array of inputs and array of users. And what I like to do is I go and under the response tab, I go here, click here, and copy paste all the response, and we can store it in a variable called as mock users, and maybe collapse it and just provide very simply this array as the second argument here. And whenever this call will happen, now instead of actually going to the API call, it will now go to this server and will return the mock users from here. And the other API call that we have is for our user detail component, and here we have this call called as get user details. So let me just copy it. Again, it's a get call. So, and instead of providing this query parameter of user ID like this, we'll have to provide it like this. Now this is a very common syntax if you come from Node.js background. And here, instead of providing the mock users directly, we can write our custom functionality like this: mock users dot find the user with the given ID of, now here we get two parameters, schema. You can check out more about this on the website itself. And the next one is request dot params dot user ID. And this is how we can actually from the result itself, we can find the given user ID and return it like this. So very simple. You can perform your own custom logic and simulate something called as the timing. So you can set a timing of 10 milliseconds, which is very quick, and you can even set it to 0 if you want. That's very easy inside this routes property. And we have our MirageJS installed now, and all we need to do is import this file into our test case here. Now I can import this thing here, but this seems like a global thing because it's housing both of our routes that we have in our whole application. Now, whenever we have to make such imports, we should do it inside the setup test.js file, which is provided by the create react app, which is for all our imports. And as you can tell, it's already importing this jest DOM thing, which is extending the jest matchers with the jest DOM, with the DOM specific matches. And here again, we will import our MirageJS file. And now our component will load our users very easily. But again, that will happen on the next tick, and still you can expect this loading to appear for like some milliseconds. Now, because that is an asynchronous operation. Now, as part of the next thing, so this is fine. Loads the users list, or let's say renders the users list. Now here we have already tested our loading component. Now let's move on and test our users list component. Now the way to test is that since this is an asynchronous thing and we can't directly expect the users list to be just present there. So instead of doing that, we'll have to use something called as the wait for utility. And this utility is a part of the React testing library. And inside the wait for function, it accepts a callback. And whenever that callback throws an error, it just exits, or else it'll execute it if it gets fired within a span of 1000 milliseconds. That's a default configuration. If you want to control that, you can provide a second argument as timeout, and you can control it from here. But you'll rarely need it because we are now mocking our API calls, and we guarantee that that call is in our control because we are setting the time here to 0 milliseconds, so it'll happen immediately. Now here we can provide something like a get function here and get by test ID. Now inside our user list component, we haven't set any test ID, so let's go ahead and do that. And here we are just rendering the user item component, so it's better to provide the test ID on the user item component here on a visible DOM component like holder. Let's say user item. Now we are rendering multiple user items based on the filtered users, right? So when that will happen, we can't expect one test ID to be present with the given test ID, so we have to use get o by test ID, and here we have user item check present. Now what this means is it'll, by the way, this thing returns a promise, and we have to use the await keyword here, and similarly we have to make sure we write async in this callback function itself. So here, after rendering the result, after rendering the user list, we are making sure that we wait for this thing, this user item test ID component to be present on our screen within 1000 milliseconds. And if it doesn't happen, it'll throw an error, and that means our test will fail. But we are making sure through MirageJS that it will happen immediately, so our test will pass. So that is our test case, and let's see if it passes or fails. So it says server is not defined. Yes, because we didn't import the right variable here. Yes, so our callback function executed, our test executed, but it said react.waitFor is not a function. Now this is a very common error that you'll find, and we are using the latest version, we are using the latest documentation of React testing library, and the Create React app sadly doesn't provide an updated version for the same. Now this wait for implementation is present only inside the 10 version, and here we have is the 9th version, and right now as of now we have the testing library version of 11, and Create React app doesn't have updated it yet, so we have to bump it manually and run npm install. So it got installed, and we need to rerun our test. And now it is giving another error which says mutation observer is not a constructor. So internally, this wait for implementation uses something called as a mutation observer as one of the browser API available, and apparently that is not available due to this version things. So again, if you just Google this, in the very first, this is an official issue on React testing library, and the way to get around that is by having this environment variable of JS environment DOM16, because by default it is using the 15th version of this JS DOM. So we'll go to our package JSON, and we're already there, and we'll provide this environment, and we need to install this dependency as well. So we'll just do that, save there. So this is now installed, and let's exit and rerun this npm test command. And now we have gone past all those errors, but now we have another error which says you should not use link tag outside the router. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are rendering, we are using this user item component directly inside our, as a isolated. We are assuming that it doesn't have any dependencies. But if you notice, this uses list, and inside it goes to user item, we have a link used there, and we have to, which means provide or wrap it with a router in order for that to work. So you have to make sure you provide all those dependencies which are required by the given component. And here it needed a dependency of this React outer DOM, so we'll just provide that. And if everything goes well, it should succeed. So we are getting this log and our tests are passing. And these logs are really heavy if you want to suppress them. From MirageJS, there's a configuration called as assert logging inside the routes function, and you can set it to false. Okay, so now our users list, both the test cases are passing. Let's go ahead now and see what else we can test in our application. Now we have tested our, we have done a unit test on the search component and an integration test on this component. What we need to now test in this integration test is that if I change anything, which is like if I do this, or simply if I write D, it loads the username. It makes sure that we have this username called as defunct, right? So let's go ahead and perform this integration test, and it filters the users based on the search text. And here we can test all these things now we can test this flow as a whole cohesive unit. So I'll use this thing here, and I'll grab a reference of my input, get by test ID. So remember the test ID we applied to that input type search. It was search box, if I remember. Search input. Let's store it, and let's perform the search input dot. So of course now we have to fire the change event on that input box, and the first argument is the input box itself, and the second argument is the event dot target dot value, and let's say our value now is def, right? And what we want to check now is that we have this user item with username as defunct, right? And this defunct should be present there. So in order to test that, now we need to find the element by its text content, right? So, and not by the test ID. So we can do something like, and of course this is an asynchronous thing, so we'll have to make sure we wait for it. This is an asynchronous test case, and here I'll have to apply this result.get. Now instead of using test ID, I'll use get O by text, and the text is defunct. And why I had to use get O instead of get by text is because this text of defunct is being repeated twice, so you have to make sure you use all and not the singular version of this. And also we have to make sure, so we have to ignore the case. We want to check the keyword defunct, and we don't have to worry about the case it is present in. So instead of a strict comparison here, we can have sort of loose comparison by using this regex notation with I stands for ignoring the case. So it will match this keyword if it is present inside the result, and will return true if it is present. So this should work now. So there's some problem with the test ID, so we'll have to double check that, okay, it was search input, as I doubted. So let's rerun it. Yep, so our test is passing now. Now you can see the bigger picture. We have tested our search input component, our users list component, and also our user item component. So we have tested our whole page right now using this integration test. So which means if we didn't even write the unit test for search input component in the first place, it would have been fine, right? And we don't actually need to write the unit test. So we should always prefer doing the integration test, and make sure we perform the test coverage really well. We touch upon all the use cases or the code branches that we have. And let's move further, and let's try to see the peculiar behavior of this style component or theming toggle button checkbox that we have by testing our whole app component as a single unit. So we now are moving one step further by creating a test for our app itself, JSX, and inside here again we'll import these things. We don't need the router. Now our whole app will get tested at once. So we don't need to provide any dependencies because it houses everything. And let's say describe app component. And let's write a first case, app mounts, and so it equals to render our app. And let's get a reference, let's get a hold of this theme toggle button component. And let me provide a data test ID to the input checkbox, or maybe not. Let's explore some other APIs of this React testing library. So we want to get a hold of our checkbox component, and on our whole application, there's only one input type checkbox available. So rather than assigning a test ID, and just for the sake of demonstration, I'll grab a reference of this toggle button through some other API. So when it renders, this result value is available. It has this property called as container, which is holding the so this app component gets created, gets appended as a child inside the div component created by this render method. So that div method, that div element is called as the container, and inside the container, now this is available to you as a regular DOM node, which means you can perform something like query selector operation or any other DOM node related operations. So instead of you doing result.get by test ID, we'll now do result.container.querySelector, and let's write a query selector in the normal CSS fashion. Type equals to checkbox. Again, the preferred way is that you go about creating a test ID, but just for the sake of discussion, I'm doing this. And now I'll make an assertion here, which means expect. So here we are expecting that. So by default, it will be in the light mode, right? As per the use theme. So by default, when the app loads for the first time, it does this. It checks for the theme node present in the local storage, or else it just gives a light theme, which means my light theme means my text color would be this. And in case of dark theme, the text color would be white. So let's go ahead and check the text color of our heading here. Let's assign it a test ID of app heading, and const app heading equals to result.get by test ID, and oops, app heading. And how can we now possibly expect something on a style component? So it's not easy, right? It's not a child or the way we have seen before. We now want to check the color property of that heading. So if we check the code for this heading style component, we are mutating the color property based on the theme, based on the theme that we have. So in case of the light theme, we'll have this 161712 color code. So it's not very straightforward, because all this gets converted is into classes, and those classes are very dynamic in nature. The hash generator is very different every time. So it's not very straightforward. What you have to do is something called as the jest style component. It's another library that helps you with the testing the style components, basically. And it's very easy to install. Let's see its use. npm install this. And the way it works is, so again, we just need to import it once, so you know where to do it inside the setup test file. And we'll do something like this, and that is it. And here inside our app, now while we are discussing this, we'll mention we want to discuss something about as the snapshot testing. Now what this means is I can do something like app heading dot to match snapshot. Now here I don't need to write any assertion. Rather, what it will do, it will create a snapshot at that instant of time, and then keep it as a copy to equate it the next time this test runs. Now as you can see, it says one snapshot written. Now let's go back and see inside the same directory in which our app.test.js is present. We have this in new directory called as snapshots, and inside this we have a file called as .snap. And here you can see this is the output of our heading component, app heading style component, and here we have this class C0, and we have this thing called as 161712 color. So this is possible only due to the import, just style components import that we imported. Otherwise it would have looked something like sc fx blah blah blah, something like this, some hash basically. So importing just style components avoids that, and now every time you'll render this, every time you'll run this test, it'll be C0 only. So snapshot testing means that the next time when I'll run my app.test.jsx, it will compare the output generated at that point of time with the snapshot that we had created here as a part of our project. And if that doesn't matches, if it'll fail the test, right? So it is a new concept, and you shouldn't use it very widely throughout your whole application. The idea is because most of the time you tend to update those snapshots whenever those fail. So the best practice is not to rely much on the snapshot test. Rather, you should rely on the assertions that we have created so far, that we have seen so far, and you should use it very sparingly in the cases where you can't directly get the inputs, or it's really hard. So that was about snapshot, and let's move back. And so our app heading component assertion we can make here as, so this just style components extend this with another matcher called as to have style value, and what we are checking here is this color of hash 161712. So that is our assertion before we toggle the checkbox, the theme checkbox. Now let's go ahead and fire the change event on the checkbox. Now if we do that, apparently in React, due to the backward compatibility with Internet Explorer, React assumes React just creates an alias of the change event with the click event. So if we perform the change event on our checkbox, it won't get fired. So that's again is an issue mentioned on the React testing library GitHub. But so I researched on it and found out that the click event works fine. So instead of providing the change event, make sure you do the click event for checkboxes and radio buttons in React. So here we provide the toggle button, and we checked it, and when we check it, what we want is that our text color should turn to white and our background color should go to black. So we can't test the background color because that's a global style. We can test what's rendering under our result umbrella, and that's easier to do. So we'll simply perform this check. So ideally that's what our goal here to test is. So apparently there's a typo here. It's not to have style value, rather it is to have style rule. Let's rerun it. Cool, so our test is passing now. And that's about the test. Now let's move further while we're having this discussion about debugging. So for example, you are stuck somewhere and you don't know what outputs, and you tend to put a lot of console log statements. Now mind this thing that this component is not being rendered inside the browser environment. So you can't simply run it in a browser and test it. Rather, the only way to do is by using something called as a node debugger, because ultimately this is a node script that's running this, that's rendering your component through here. So if you go to Create React App website, it exposes this script called as test debug, and here we can just copy and paste it in our project. And now instead of running npm run test, we'll run npm run test debug, and let's see what happens. So it says debugger listening on this WebSocket address. So this is a WebSocket address, and all we need to do is we'll need to go to our Chrome and write inspect here, and it'll open this screen for you. And here you can see our React script test.js file is running now. So I need to click here inspect, and my debugger is just present here now. So if I move further, since I haven't added any breakpoints in my application, it will run. Right now it is running, and if I want to, let's say, debug at a given point as I want to see what's present inside my app heading, so let's put a debugger here and save it. It fails like this, so apparently it is happening because of this thing we haven't provided in our new test script. Let's rerun it. So as soon as it started executing our app.test.jsx, it redirected me to this opened debugger tool here of Chrome, and now we are here. So just like we do normal debugging, we can now debug what's present maybe inside our app heading component, and what's there in the result variable. We can do something like result.get by test ID, and checking if we have the search input component, and yes we do. So all debugging things you can perform here. You can now move to the next line and see what happens, just like that. And that's about the debugging. So we have covered all the major ways of how you can test your React applications, and we saw what are the errors that occur when you try to do it in the Create React app environment due to the version problems that it has. Now, the last thing that we want to discuss is about test coverage. So what is test coverage? It gives you a measure of the code that has been covered under test. It tells you whether your app has been tested or not fully. So we'd like to know the tests that we have written, the integrated tests we have written, whether they cover our application well or not. So first of all, we have this test script present here, and we can basically remove this jest environment prefix from here and here. They work the same way, and all we need to do is just simply add this coverage flag if you are using the Create React app bootstrap project, and here just run npm test. And besides running the test for you now, it'll generate a test coverage. So it is giving an error, which is possibly due to the 16 version of JS DOM that we are using. So instead of using the 16 version, I figured out we have to use the 14 version, and that you not even have to install it extra. So we can dump our 16th version and use it like this and run it again. And that is it. You see this table right here? It is giving us a measure of all the files that are present inside the src directory that we are giving Jest to test, and this is a measure of the coverage that we can see. To see it in a more elaborate manner, there are something called as test coverage tools, and one of them, very popular one, is Istanbul, and that is provided by React scripts as well. So if you see here, there's a sort of folder that's been created in your project called as coverage, and if you open it, you'll see this lcov report, which is line coverage report. Just open it, and here's this index.html. Now this HTML you need to open in a browser. So what I like to do is, in my VS Code, I have this extension called as live server, which I just installed, and just below here in the status bar, you click it after selecting the HTML file, and this is how the HTML coverage looks like, and it tells you exactly what percentage of the statements are covered and how many percentage of branches are covered. For example, inside our users list component, if we click here, we have this index.jsx, and this branch couldn't get covered because we didn't test for the empty case, wherein we emptied the search box input and checked whether it loads back the original users or not. So it precisely is telling us which branches we couldn't test. And same way, if I go inside my src, this seems like this MirageJS is 75% tested, and if I go at the bottom, so obviously we didn't implement the test for the detail page, so which is why this API or this line never got called. So it's telling us that it's not fully tested. So maybe we can go ahead and write tests for the user detail page, and it will also become 100% then. So that's about the code coverage tools. It's as simple as introducing a flag on the command line for the test as -- coverage, and that's it. Congrats guys, that was the final piece of our puzzle of creating the web app in React.js. We have covered all the major topics, and you are now qualified to create your own applications and present them.